It all started when I was in college, working as a pizza delivery driver to cover my expenses. Most nights were routine delivering to dorms, family homes, or the occasional late-night party. But one night stood out, a night I'll never forget. Even now, years later, it haunts me. It was a Friday evening, just after 10 o'clock. My shift was winding down, and I was looking forward to going home. That's when I got the last order of the night. The address was outside the city, about a 20-minute drive into the countryside. At first, I didn't think much of it. We occasionally got orders from rural areas, and while it was uncommon, it wasn't unheard of. The ticket was paid for in advance, which meant no awkward exchange of cash or cards. All I had to do was drop off the pizza and head back. Easy enough, or so I thought. The drive started uneventfully. The city lights faded in my rearview mirror as I drove down increasingly narrow roads. The hum of my car's engine was the only sound, apart from the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The GPS guided me deeper into isolation. Streetlights became sparse, and the surrounding trees grew denser. Soon, my headlights were the only source of light, piercing through the thick darkness ahead. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. There was something about the silence, the absence of life, that made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the unease, blaming it on exhaustion and an overactive imagination. After all, it was just a delivery. As I approached the destination, the house came into view. It was a two-story structure that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The paint was peeling, the windows were dark, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. A single dim porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the cracked walkway. I parked my car and stared at the house for a moment, feeling a growing sense of dread. Everything about the place screamed, "Turn back." Still, I had a jobs to do. I grabbed the pizza box and stepped out of the car. The night air was chilly, far colder than it should have been for that time of year. I felt a sudden heaviness, like the atmosphere was pressing down on me. The house seemed to loom over me as I approached, its dark windows like empty eyes, watching my every move. I reached the front door and knocked. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the house were hollow inside. For a moment, there was no response, and I considered leaving the pizza on the porch and driving away. But just as I was about to turn, the door creaked open. A man in his 40s stood there. His appearance was disheveled, with messy hair and dark circles under his eyes. He looked at me with confusion. "Are you sure you have the right address?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. I double-checked the receipt. "This is 1489 Oak Ridge, right?" He hesitated, then nodded. "That's my address, but we didn't order a pizza." Puzzled, I showed him the order slip. He studied it for a moment before calling over his shoulder, "Did anyone here order pizza?" A woman's voice responded from inside. No, why? Two small children appeared behind her, their curious eyes peeking out at me. All of them confirmed they hadn't placed any order. Maybe it's a prank, I suggested, though I felt uneasy. To be sure, I decided to call the number listed on the receipt. After a few rings, someone picked up. A raspy voice on the other end said, "Yes, this is the correct address. Bring the pizza to the shed behind the house." My stomach dropped. The voice had an unnatural quality to it, like it was distorted or forced. I relayed the message to the man at the door, whose expression darkened. "We don't use the shed," he said quietly. "It's been abandoned for years." A tense silence followed. The man exchanged a worried glance with his wife, who stepped back inside with the children. Finally, he grabbed a flashlight and insisted on investigating. Against my better judgment, I followed him. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but curiosity, or perhaps fear of offending, kept me there. The path to the shed was overgrown, the tall grass brushing against my legs as we walked. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was resisting our progress. The shed came into view, a small, decrepit building with a sagging roof and broken windows. The door hung ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. The man pushed the door open, and the flashlight beam swept across the interior. Inside was a scene straight out of a nightmare. A filthy mattress lay on the floor, surrounded by empty food containers and bottles. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it nonsensical scribbles, but one phrase stood out: "I'm watching you." I felt a chill run down my spine. The man cursed under his breath, his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. "No one's been in here for years," he muttered, more to himself than to me. But it was clear someone had been here recently. The food containers were fresh, and there was a faint smell of decay in the air. We were about to leave when the man's flashlight caught something unusual. In the corner of the shed, partially hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, was a stack of photographs. He picked one up and froze. It was a picture of his house, taken from the woods. Other photos showed his family, his wife, his children, even himself, all taken without their knowledge. Some were from inside their home. Panic set in. "We need to call the police," he said, his voice trembling. But before we could act, a sound came from the woods. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder and more distinct. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming closer. The man grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the house. We ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he led the way. The footsteps behind us quickened, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. When we reached the house, he slammed the door shut and locked it. His wife, now holding a phone, had already called the police. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. The children huddled close to their mother, who tried to keep them calm. The man stood by the window, peering out into the darkness. I stayed near the door, pizza box still in hand, my mind racing. Eventually, flashing blue lights lit up the driveway. The police searched the property and the surrounding woods, but found no one. However, they did confirm that someone had been living in the shed. They took the photographs and other items as evidence, promising to investigate further. I left shortly after, my nerves shot. The drive back to the city was a blur. I couldn't stop replaying the night's events in my head. Who had placed the order? Why had they lured me there? And, most disturbingly, who had been watching that family and for how long? That night marked the last time I took a rural delivery. I eventually quit the job and focused on my studies, but the memory of that night has stayed with me. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I think about the voice on the phone and the footsteps in the woods. And I wonder if they ever truly caught the person responsible, or if they're still out there, watching. Before we could process what we were seeing, my phone rang again. The same number. I hesitated, but answered. The voice on the other end was colder this time. "You should have left the pizza at the door." A loud crash came from the house. The man and I sprinted back, adrenaline pumping. His wife stood frozen in the living room, her face pale. "There's someone inside," she whispered, clutching the children tightly. The air felt heavy, suffused with an eerie silence, broken only by the shallow, panicked breaths of the family. The man, visibly trembling, grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and motioned for me to stay back. But I couldn't just stand there. Every instinct told me to run, but something deeper compelled me to stay. Grabbing a heavy lamp from the side table, I followed him into the living room. The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Slow, deliberate, and unnervingly calm, they sent chills down my spine. The house, dimly lit with flickering bulbs, seemed to close in around us as we moved toward the staircase. Each creak of the wooden steps felt deafening, amplifying the tension that hung thick in the air. At the top of the stairs, a gaunt figure emerged from the shadows. His presence was suffocating, his wild eyes locking onto us with an unsettling intensity. He held a crowbar in his hand, its edge glinting ominously in the dim light. His smile was grotesque, a twisted display of malice that made my stomach churn. He didn't flinch as the man of the house lunged at him, knife raised. The struggle was brutal, a chaotic clash of desperation and fury. The intruder swung the crowbar with alarming force, narrowly missing me as I stood frozen for a split second, gripping the lamp like a lifeline. Summoning every ounce of courage, I swung the lamp with all my might. The impact was sickening, the sound reverberating through the narrow hallway. He staggered, his grip on the crowbar loosening, and the homeowner seized the opportunity to pin him to the ground. The scene was a blur of shouts, heavy breathing, and muffled sobs from downstairs. The man's wife had called the police, and their arrival couldn't have been more timely. Red and blue lights flooded the street outside, as officers stormed the house, their presence both a relief and a stark reminder of how close we had come to disaster. As they led the intruder away, his gaze lingered on the family. His parting words were venomous, laced with a chilling promise. "I'll never let you go." The aftermath was a whirlwind of questions, statements, and reassurances that felt hollow. The police pieced together the puzzle. The man was the wife's ex, someone she had left years ago after enduring his abusive behavior. He had been stalking her, his obsession festering until it culminated in this horrifying encounter. The pizza order, as we learned, was his way of luring someone to the house, likely to create a diversion or cover his tracks. That night left me shaken to my core. Sleep became elusive, every creak and shadow rekindling the terror of those moments. I quit my job as a delivery driver shortly after, unable to shake the memory of that night or the what-ifs that haunted me. What if I hadn't followed the man to the shed? What if we hadn't confronted the intruder in time? The scenarios played out endlessly in my mind, each more harrowing than the last. The house itself seemed to bear the scars of that night. The broken window where the intruder had entered, the scuffed floors from the struggle, and the faint outline of the crowbar's swing etched into the wall all served as grim reminders. For the family, it was a fresh trauma layered atop old wounds. The wife's resilience in the face of such a nightmare was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She had fought so hard to escape her past, only for it to claw its way back into her life. In the days that followed, the small community rallied around them. Neighbors brought meals, offered to repair the damages, and kept a watchful eye on the house. But no amount of goodwill could erase the lingering fear. For the children, the shadows held monsters. For the parents, every unfamiliar sound was a potential threat. As for me, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. The voice on the phone, the calculated nature of the intruder's plan, all felt like a scene from a horror movie. But it wasn't fiction. It was real, and it served as a grim reminder of how fragile our sense of security can be. Months later, I found myself driving past that house. It looked different, with new windows and a fresh coat of paint, but the memories came rushing back, vivid and unrelenting. I pulled over, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions: relief that the family was safe, guilt for being part of the ordeal, and an inexplicable pull to make sense of it all. I started writing about that night, hoping to process the trauma and perhaps warn others about the dangers lurking in the most ordinary of places. The more I wrote, the more I realized how many layers there were to the story. It wasn't just about the intruder or the attack. It was about resilience, community, and the strength it takes to confront fear head-on. The family eventually moved away, seeking a fresh start, far from the shadows of their past. I kept in touch for a while, exchanging occasional messages that spoke of healing and hope. They deserved peace, a chance to rebuild their lives without the specter of that night looming over them. For me, the experience became a turning point. It pushed me to reevaluate my life, to appreciate the mundane moments that often go unnoticed. It also ignited a sense of purpose, to advocate for awareness, to share stories that remind us of our shared vulnerability and strength. Even now, the memory of that night lingers. It's a reminder that life can take unexpected turns, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And perhaps most importantly, it's a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who refuse to let darkness define their story.